just days before, a fire had broken out at Windscale, the country's first nuclear reactor.
I looked down onto a blazing inferno.
Britain was on the brink of an unprecedented disaster.
If it goes up, we will all go with it.
The fire threatened to destroy the special relationship before it began.
You could imagine bottom dropping out of Macmillan's stomach.
Facing humiliation, Macmillan decided to keep the truth about Britain's worst nuclear disaster secret.
He covered it up, plain and simple.
Now, secret tape recordings reveal the reasons behind Macmillan's cover-up.
At first they said if it went over 1,200, oh, God help us.
And why the men and women who fought the fire felt he betrayed them. This is a story of political spin before the phrase was invented, and how Britain's nuclear hopes turned into a nuclear nightmare.
I have never been so frightened in my whole life.
Mankind had not faced anything like this ever before.
Before dawn on July 16, 1945, at the Alamogordo Army Air Base in New Mexico, a small band of military and civilian technicians waited nervously. In the control shack was Dr. J.R. Oppenheimer, who, assisted by Dr. I. Rabi and others, had directed the making of the bomb itself.
The automatic controls got it now. Rob, this time the stakes are really high.
It's going to work all right, Robert, and I'm sure we'll never be sorry for it.
Minus 5 seconds.
The world entered the atomic age in the 1940s when the U.S. built nuclear bombs to end World War II. By the 1950s, other countries had developed their own atom bombs, and the prospect of nuclear war was very real. But President Dwight Eisenhower also pushed for peaceful ways to harness the power of the atom, laying the foundation for today's nuclear energy industry, as you'll see in this Energy Then from 1955.
Information about the beneficial uses of atomic energy knows no national boundaries. The facts are available today, for nuclear energy isn't waiting to help people everywhere in some brave new world of the future. The peaceful atom is here now to serve what President Eisenhower has termed the needs rather than the fears of mankind. In a piece of uranium the size of a walnut, there's as much potential energy as in the amount of coal to fill a 100-car train. The question is how to get this power, how to put this vast energy to work in the power plants to run the turbines of tomorrow.
Since the dawn of the atomic age, the world has experienced a steady buildup of a nuclear arsenal. Consequently, there's a massive backlog of radioactive waste byproducts. The long-ignored stockpiling of nuclear waste has resulted in a situation where products designed to protect us are now threatening our own health and safety. The United States alone is armed with 25,000 nuclear warheads. 17 facilities across the country are involved in the research, design, testing, and production of nuclear bombs. These facilities have accumulated approximately 300 million cubic feet of radioactive waste. Cleanup of these sites, where possible, could cost $100 million. At Hanford, Rocky Flats, Savannah River, and other weapons-making sites, citizens are suffering from DOE negligence and secrecy. In recent months, the Department of Energy has at least been trying to clean house and is now admitting its own gross mismanagement. States are closing their borders to hot trash as they come to grips with the nuclear waste dilemma.
Well, we hope to. We know that the governors in the West are very concerned about our difficulties. We don't want to have permanent storage in Idaho or Colorado, and we're working to open a facility that's been 10 years in the making in New Mexico, and we have a few more months to go on that.
Well, if you only have a few more months to go, then everybody will be happy, because I understand that Governor Romer says the site in Colorado will be full up in 4 months. Are you sure you can open that New Mexico facility in a few months' time?
Well, we were targeted to open it up in October of this year. That has been about a goal for the past 5 years.
What happens if New Mexico joins this a regional revolt? Are they going to demand more safety standards than they might have, given all the publicity, Mr.
Well, we need to have that stored safely, and there must be a solution. If we don't have a solution for storing nuclear waste, we've got to stop producing them. That's all.
Independent scientists think the danger is much more imminent.
And it's also possible for the brine to come up and get into the aquifer and move through that, move fairly rapidly. The travel time now is now known to be rapid in the matter of months or years, and then it would emerge in the Pecos River and get out into the biosphere.
The Rustler Aquifer flows into the Pecos River from the WIPP site, and the Pecos River downstream of Carlsbad at that point. So there it's not used for drinking water for Carlsbad, but it does flow into Texas, and it is used both for drinking and irrigation and livestock watering downstream.
We think that this new discovery, or the awareness now that there is a brine reservoir underneath the site, is probably enough so that the WIPP site won't make the EPA standards.
We feel, I think, as a consensus, that WIPP should proceed, that there is nothing in these issues that should cause it to be terminated or even slowed.
WIPP is presently exempt from meeting EPA standards because WIPP is designed as a facility for research and development. WIPP is exempt from NRC licensing. WIPP is also exempt from the Hazardous Waste Act, and unless this act is amended, WIPP shipments would be going to an unlicensed facility. And lastly, the state has no veto power.
One of the things that I think it's important to understand is how this whole process got started. When I first, in 1981, went into the negotiating room with the DOE, their lawyers were there, and I pointed out to their lawyers and I said, well, there are problems with this consultation and cooperation agreement from the state's point of view. This needs to be modified, this needs to be modified, and I told them the ways in which the state needed to have its rights protected. At that point, the lawyer at the time for the DOE leaned over the table to me and said, you don't understand. We don't have any obligation to do these things for you. You either accept the agreement that we're offering you now, or we'll just go ahead and proceed. Period. In other words, they were basically saying to me, we'll do this out of the goodness of our heart. And I didn't believe that at the time. I still didn't believe that.
This consultation and cooperation agreement is the only leverage the state of New Mexico has at present. New Mexico Representative Richardson sponsored a bill in Congress which requires that WIPP meet EPA standards before the land is withdrawn from the Bureau of Land Management and given over to DOE's exclusive control.
This is what the bill that I have does. It says that no waste can come in whatsoever unless all EPA standards are met. All of them. And they can't have experiments.
The Senate version of the land withdrawal bill does allow for experiments. These experiments are controversial because they permit a percentage of waste to be placed at WIPP without meeting EPA standards.
We know fission products break down and with time become non-radioactive, but high-level waste is highly radioactive for long periods of time. It must be isolated for hundreds of years. Unreprocessed used fuel must be isolated for thousands of years.
Nuclear waste simply tossed into the water. This was the face of waste disposal for decades. Greenpeace activists tried to prevent this, in vain. So what's the story behind all this dangerous radioactive waste in the sea? We have been conducting research for a year now in an attempt to find out what became of the barrels of nuclear waste. We also discovered pipes through which the nuclear waste is pumped into the sea. We visited fish markets, met experts. As well as a lot of people who are scared about radiation. We asked politicians about the legacy of the nuclear industry, what's actually going on down there at the bottom of the sea. And because the answers turned out to be unsatisfactory, we went looking for the barrels of nuclear waste ourselves. We are going to get to the bottom of what happened in the past. We want to know, where is it radioactive, and what is the source of radiation off the coasts of Europe? Anything radioactive was dumped in those steel barrels. Contents: low-level radioactive waste from hospitals, but also radioactive waste from nuclear plants across Europe. For decades, the nuclear industry has used the sea as a dump site. May 1967. In the port of Emden, Lower Saxony, nuclear waste from Germany, Britain and France will be loaded onto the British cargo ship Topaz. The barrels are to be dumped in at least 4,000 meters of water. The nuclear waste was supposed to be diluted by the water. This is considered to be an absolute certainty. The British crew of the Topaz dumps the radioactive load into the sea. More than 100,000 tons of nuclear waste disappear into the North Atlantic, the Irish Sea, but also into the shallow waters of the English Channel. Then in the mid-1970s, Greenpeace stages various actions and raises awareness about these dumping activities. An outcry resounds across Europe. "32 years after the boat operations in the Atlantic, we meet two of the activists from that time at the Greenpeace offices in Hamburg. Harold Zindler and Roland Hipp haven't seen one another for a long time. Both fought with great conviction and commitment against the dumping. We show Harold Zindler the video footage. Even today, years later, a chill runs down his spine.
This is cynical.
But the nuclear industry was unmoved by the Greenpeace actions. The dumping continued. Environmentalists were criminalized and attacked.
Then we were taken captive on the ship and were locked up in the bow. The dumping continued and we could hear it, and what we had just witnessed actually happened. A dinghy was hit again, and at that point the action was called off. It was far too dangerous and people could have been injured or even killed.
These events took place more than 3 decades ago. What has happened to the nuclear waste down there on the ocean floor since then? Who knows anything more about it?
Come in. Thank you.
We meet with the nuclear physicist John Large in London. He was involved in the development of a British atomic bomb in the 1960s and knows a lot about the dumping, particularly by the military. Large owns an extraordinary souvenir, a non-radioactive fuel rod from the Sellafield nuclear facility. Fuel rods of this kind were sunk deep in the ground. Large tells us something surprising.
The men on the ship were being exposed to radioactivity while they were on the ship. So the ship was making its way to its dump site. Those men were like ticking clocks. The longer they stayed near the waste, the better. So it was on the captain to actually reach his allocated dump site within a certain time. If the ship ran into weather difficulties or was making a bad headway, it was slow, the captain was not concerned necessarily about where to dump the waste, but the time that the crew were being, and himself, were being exposed to radioactivity. So when the clock ran out, that's when they dumped. So there can be no assurance that the radioactive waste was dumped where the civil servants said it was dumped.
So how can these barrels ever be located for, say, control purposes? A look at official British dumping inventories raises even more doubt about the accuracy of the information. Entries relating to coordinates or ocean depths are often marked "not known." It gets worse. Even when it comes to information regarding radioactivity, we repeatedly read "not known, not known, not known." This is according to an inventory of dumpings in the Irish Sea. Who could possibly know where the barrels are located? Perhaps the UK Health Protection Agency, HPA, might be able to help, as it is responsible for radioactive waste. We meet Dr. John Cooper, departmental head of the Center for Radiation, Chemical and Environmental Hazards. He knows all about the problem of dumped nuclear waste barrels. Can it really be that the dumping inventories are incorrect?
I would be surprised if there were other disposals which were not included, but of course you cannot completely exclude that.
The military did never tell you what they dump, so what do you do with this fact?
Well, I think at some point you have to rely on the information you've got.
The UK nuclear reprocessing site Sellafield, formerly Windscale. The atomic waste also came from here and disappeared into the Irish Sea, into the Channel, into the Atlantic. The suspicion, highly radioactive nuclear waste may have been dumped. It was officially banned.
If you look at the inventories, the analysis of materials that have been recovered from the seabed that have only come from dumping, not atmospheric testing, from dumping, there's no doubt in my mind that high-level waste has been physically dumped at sea.
That would mean that the inventories are incorrect in this particular. How could such errors occur? Are they actually errors at all, or was it intentional?
That are written in a future.
Michael Meacher might know more about this. He was Minister of State for the Environment from 1997 to 2003 and an opponent of the dumping policy.
Charging for workplace parking levies and other measures which local authorities will put into their local charge.
Today, the former senior minister in Tony Blair's cabinet is an ordinary backbencher. We show him the inventories. Who made false statements? Who knew anything about the dumpings?
I'd be very glad to have a project here, and it's often likely to be a minor. The Commission will give guidance and advice to ensure that
I suspect that that was an agreement between the Ministry of Defence, the Army, and the nuclear industry. I presume this was I won't say a plot, but this was an agreement between them all to do something which they would rather not anyone knew about, and that's why it's now impossible to get the information about exactly what was dumped, where it was dumped. I think we have a pretty good idea where it was dumped, but we don't know, and the quantity of it we certainly don't know, and the effects of dumping that in the sea over decades or centuries, again, we don't know. I mean, this is a sort of conspiracy.
Even Greenpeace didn't know at that time how bad it was, but the protests were successful. The dumping of nuclear waste was forbidden worldwide in 1993. Greenpeace activists were celebrated as heroes, as in the case here in Vigo, Spain. For more than half a century, barrels of nuclear waste had been dumped into the sea in keeping with the motto at the time: the solution of pollution is dilution.
fundamental underlying problem was that they assumed that if you dilute the radioactivity with tons and tons of water, it's safe to discharge. If you dump solid radioactive waste and it dissolves in tons and tons and tons of water, then it's safe to dispose of it in that way. And that is being proved wrong time and time and time again.
The first evidence that dangerous, highly toxic waste, which has accumulated over the years, simply doesn't disappear through dilution, was gathered by experts after an exploratory trip in the mid-1980s. Germany sent the research vessel Walter Herwig to the Atlantic dump sites. The disposal points were examined. In so doing, the scientists inadvertently salvaged 9 barrels. The researchers found plutonium in the water, in the seabed, and in the fish. Internal papers from the Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, state increased concentrations of plutonium in the dump sites indicate plutonium leaks from the barrels. So now the toxins have finally arrived in the biosphere. Monaco, seat of the IAEA's marine laboratories. Biologists here are researching the dangers of nuclear waste in the sea. This is the head of the laboratory, Dr. Hartmut Nies. The experts feed contaminated food to marine animals. They want to find out how it will affect the organisms. Dr. Nies and his colleagues are also in charge of the barrels of dumped nuclear waste. The key question is, what happened to the barrels? Are there still any undamaged barrels down there after all these years? Or are they all corroded?
We examine the ocean floor constantly in any case, and we would certainly have noticed any barrels.
So you would assume that the barrels in the English Channel would all have rusted open or have simply gone?
I would assume so.
And if you would now find undamaged barrels, wouldn't it be better to salvage them?
If it's not going to cost me a lot to get them out, of course. Yes.
There hasn't been a single new investigation into the dump sites for 12 years. Is Nies right? Are all the barrels corroded? We decide to have a look for ourselves. Herd Deep, an underwater channel in the channel close to the Channel Islands, is the only dump site within range of our resources and capabilities. We have chartered a boat. Herd Deep is approximately 10 nautical miles northwest of the Channel Islands, Alderney. A small submarine is supposed to provide us with video images. The unit is almost impossible to maneuver because the English Channel is known for its strong currents. The Greenpeace activist Harold Zindler is on board.
If I had the resources, I would fetch up a barrel immediately and dump it on the doorstep of those responsible. It is irresponsible. More than 28,000 barrels of nuclear waste have been dumped there. It's unbelievable.
Herd Deep's special attribute. Thousands of barrels of nuclear waste are not stored at a depth of 5,000 meters, but are sitting there in a mere 100 meters of water. Tension mounts. According to the inventories, there are munitions from the war down there, as well as nuclear waste. What are we going to find?
Bescheid, wenn du Kabel brauchst. Ja, gib mir mal.
We filmed a nuclear waste barrel on the first dive, undamaged. So there are sealed barrels still down there which could be salvaged. Of course, we are not permitted to salvage the barrel. On the second dive, we also discover this totally corroded barrel. Up on the boat, the find leaves Harold Zindler upset.
What shocked me most here? We discovered barrels very close to land in 140 meters of water in a place where we can even see Alderney and are looking towards France, which is barely 30 minutes away.
We return to Alderney. What does this find mean for the residents of the island? Professor Chris Busby approaching Alderney. The physicist was here decades ago. A doctor had asked him to come. There was an unusually high incidence of cancers on the island. Busby has been actively campaigning against the dangers of nuclear radiation for years now. He is regarded as something of an enfant terrible, stubborn and awkward. Rather than to listen to his pointed opinions, he is the sort of person whom the authorities prefer to stigmatize. Alderney is a peaceful place. Time passes more slowly here than elsewhere. It has a total of 2,400 residents. The island is also a refuge for well-to-do British pensioners. But the place may not be as idyllic as it at first seems. To our surprise, Busby first of all takes us to the cemetery. According to the thesis, you have to look for the victims. That will tell you more than any maximum radiation levels.
35.
Where?
There. No, for 50.
So you only need to find one case of childhood leukemia on the whole island, and you've got an answer. You've got too many childhood leukemias. Too many. Another LIAM.
We try to find out whether there really is an increased incidence of cancer deaths. However, the UK government keeps the precise statistics under lock and key. Data protection policy. Perhaps we'll find clues on the island. We take a stab at it and ask in the residential area near the cemetery about causes of death.
One of the estate agent's first wives died from a brain tumour, and then when we came over a few years ago, his second wife had a brain tumour, but I think she's all right now. And there was actually a series on the television in England about operations where they filmed them live, and they filmed a chap having a brain tumour removed, and we found out that he was from Alderney, and he in fact died last year. But I think there's been a child here, at least one child with a brain tumour. We're going back to England.
Statistically speaking, this would be very noticeable, but the authorities have only one thing to say to Chris Busby. Everything is fine.
Wow. Right.
The professor goes with us to the beach. He wants to measure radiation. The competent UK authorities argue that both the quantity and levels of radiation were far too low to cause harm to people.
What we have learned since the 1980s is that material that goes into the sea comes back to land. And it does this because the particles on the seabed, the very fine particles, attract the radioactivity, attract the plutonium and attract the cesium and all the other stuff.
Professor Busby wants to go even further out. Dusk begins to fall and the tide starts to come in. Busby criticizes the authorities because they didn't do any of their own measurements, but simply guesstimated the levels of radioactivity out there in Herd Deep.
I would expect to find cesium-137, ruthenium-106, a whole load of stuff. Plutonium.
Plutonium?
Yeah, for sure.
So that might be quite poisonous here.
Well, of course.
Chris Busby's gamma spectrometer measures increased levels of radiation at this point.
204.
But there was a hell of a lot of uranium from the Herd Deep. They dumped an enormous amount of enriched uranium in the Herd Deep. That was a very big amount of material there, so it's entirely possible that that also has ended up here.
We also take readings with our Geiger counter. It is true, the level of radiation has increased. How dangerous is this for the people here on Alderney?
Only requires one cell to be damaged to go on to form another cell and another cell and another cell and eventually form cancer. So every single dose, right down to a single radionuclide decay, has a finite probability of causing cancer.
Is Busby on the right track, the outsider? And shouldn't the undamaged barrels be salvaged as a precaution? What does the director at the HPA, Dr. John Cooper, have to say?
I don't think there was a great risk, a significant risk from the disposals at Herd Deep.
Even if it is only 100 meter.
Yeah, it's probably something you wouldn't do these days. I think the best way of approaching this is to leave the material where it is.
We chase up the Atomic Energy Agency, competent in these matters. How does the agency evaluate the dangers of these dumped barrels?
We have seen that the sea's capacity for dilution is so vast. We have seen in the discharges from Sellafield and La Hague, which have drifted with the currents over many years, that if this water were not seawater, then it would be suitable as drinking water.
However, there are differing opinions about this. Professor Klaus Gruppen has published textbooks on radiation protection. So, what about dilution in seawater to levels that would meet the standards required of drinking water? And is everything really hunky-dory?
If the amount in which it is diluted is infinitely vast, if I discharge it into outer space, then it might be well diluted. But the Earth is a very small celestial body, and the concentration is constantly growing.
Our conclusion: the radioactivity is only spreading out instead of disappearing altogether through dilution. There are no exact details about the location and number of barrels, and there is disagreement as to whether they should be salvaged. The dumping of nuclear waste in the sea was banned worldwide in 1993, yet the nuclear industry has come up with other ways. They no longer dump the barrels at sea. They built kilometers of underwater pipes through which the radioactive effluent now flows freely into the sea. One of these pipes is situated in Normandy. It comes from the French reprocessing plant at La Hague. Greenpeace protested here too, underwater. To environmentalists, the matter is clear-cut. This method of disposal through pipes destroys the environment, just like the dumping of barrels. The advantage for the nuclear industry? No more bad press because of the barrels. For the disposal via waste pipes remains hidden from the public eye, quite literally. LAG is the waste processing plant servicing nuclear waste from all over Europe. Germany's casters rolling into Normandy. But the people here are no longer willing to accept the abuse of the sea as a nuclear dustbin. David Boyer is a physicist, founder, and chairman of an environmental group. He is visiting a local primary school today and telling the children about radioactivity, toxic plutonium, and nuclear waste. David Boyer asks us to come with him to the fish market. The physicists criticized the assessment criteria relating the health of marine organisms. According to him, Fukushima has changed things. We need to rethink. One can no longer say clean water equals clean fish equals healthy fish.
Some of them contaminated and some of them not. It's more difficult with fish because they move around. So one fish picked up someplace, might have been in a radioactive place, get contaminated. So in these mussels, you might find something.
So what could be found in this mussel, for example?
Some of the radioactive elements discharged by the reprocessing plant, like iodine, cobalt. So it's more like gambling, huh? Like you might be lucky or unlucky.
The toxic waste from the reprocessing plant at La Hague is no longer a just local problem for the people of Normandy. According to Boyer, marine pollution is a European problem.
If you balance the benefit against the detriment, this benefit is almost zero, except for the local economy. But as a global point of view, it's zero. And the detriment is evident, so of course it is a sin.
Boyer travels with us to Ostend, Belgium, 400 kilometers from La Hague. He will show us how far the radioactive toxins have already spread, for their origin has been precisely measured. He meets up with a Belgian activist. He gathers seaweed. The environmental activists distrust the measurements made by the operators. Boyer travels with us to Holland. He wants to collect seaweed samples for his lab here as well.
I have the iodine, the seaweeds from Germany there. We collect, this was sent to Accra by a German friend of us who was worrying, is there iodine contamination from La Hague up to Germany? And the answer is yes. We find iodine in the seaweed up to Germany.
We are back in Accro's labs, the Citizens Initiative. The water that was just brought here by volunteers has given a 5-fold higher tritium value than the rating supplied by the French operator Arriva. It is now obvious why the citizens take their own measurements. David Boyer has brought some marine animals from the market. Pierre Babet, a molecular biologist, tells us what happened to the animals.
We now know that there is a very good exchange between the deep sea and the upper water layers. The radioactive toxins accumulate in the food chain. This little worm here, for example, can contain 2,000 to 3,000 times more radioactivity than its environment. It is then eaten by the next biggest creature and so on. At the end of the food chain, we discovered damage to the reproductive cells of crabs. And this damage, these genetic defects, are inherited from one generation to the next.
And the effects and the mechanism of human cells and animal cells are the same?
Yes, yes. I don't know, a cell in human or in animal, it's the same.
Highly toxic plutonium is found in grey seals off the coasts of Europe. Radioactive cesium has been found in porpoises. The animal impact upon future generations is unknown, so marine biologists insist every animal must be protected from radioactivity. But how dangerous is the nuclear waste in the sea for us humans? We look for answers to this question in the UK, in Sellafield. There have been some alarming reports from there. The second disposal pipe for Europe's nuclear waste is located in the north of England. As in France, it was Greenpeace environmental activists who drew attention to the pipe. That was in 1997. Also present, the then 35-year-old Sean Burney.
And electricity.
For nearly 2 decades, Burney has been actively campaigning against the discharges. It is a struggle for numbers, limits, but also the prerogative of interpretation. Burney is concerned about the people here on the coast. The government has had many of them examined.
You see here along this coast there are people living on this beach. You can see these small houses, and they are what's considered one of the critical groups because they live right on the beach. They're exposed every day to the sea and therefore to radiation coming in from the sea. So their houses are full of plutonium dust. Their bodies will be more radioactive. They'll have plutonium in their teeth. The closer you are to Sellafield in the UK, the more plutonium you have in your teeth.
The pipe from Sellafield is clearly visible only from the air. But how could the disposal contractor bypass the ban on discharges? Nuclear waste is still being dumped in the sea. The operators argue this is land-based disposal and therefore legal. It has been approved by the authorities.
Is there a scientific, logical reason why barrels are prohibited and discharges are allowed?
I think it is more a philosophical question.
This is not a philosophical question for him. Wolfgang Rinneberg was Director for Nuclear Safety at the German Federal Ministry of the Environment and is an expert in the disposal of radioactive waste.
No, there is no logical reason for it. Ultimately, there are only economic reasons. The question is, how expensive would it be to install appropriate filtration systems, for example, that would ensure that a discharge of this kind is close to zero? Perhaps this plant would prove to be uneconomical. That's what's behind it. There's no evidence of a physical reason or any other reasons for that matter.
Every day more radioactive swill flows into the Irish Sea. Nuclear waste from Sellafield can now be found on the Norwegian coast. In the meantime, the local residents are given to believe all is under control here on the beaches around Sellafield. The staff at Sellafield make their presence felt. The operators and authorities both claim there is no risk. Checks and controls are being carried out all the time. And yet plutonium can be found here on a daily basis. The toxic waste returns from the sea here as well. It leaches out, it dries, and is left lying on the beach. The people here have long since guessed that the dangers are greater than those responsible care to admit.
We're not going to change the world. Little people don't do it. It's the big people that do that. So I've never heard any frightening tales. It could be kept quiet. It could be under the carpet. It might not be. But until I know, the sea's being polluted all over the world.
The beach at Sellafield has won an award for being one of the cleanest in England. every day a groundhog or a small excavator removes plutonium from the beach. A scanner locates small radioactive particles at a depth of 30 centimeters. In recent decades, the operator at Sellafield has tossed more than 500 kilograms of plutonium into the sea. A woman from the Netherlands, Janine Alice Smith, lived inland from Sellafield for many decades. She is positive that the British authorities are playing down the problem of radioactivity. And she is also convinced that years ago, plutonium from Sellafield caused her young son's illness, leukemia.
So the reason I became... We used to go to the beach, and we used to spend lots of time on the beach. And like all babies, he picked up sand, he put it over his head, he put it in his mouth. At the age of 12, he got leukemia. And I then realized that he was not the only one. There were more children in the area. Donald, he did okay. He was diagnosed as a little child, but at the age of 19, he was afraid that it would come back. And Gemma, she died at the age of 7. She had to have a bone marrow transplant, but she died of infection.
Windscale, the biggest commercial nuclear reprocessing works in the world.
As early as the 1980s, regional television had already reported of the increased incidence of leukemia in children. For journalists, it was obvious that the operator and even the health authorities were in denial about the true extent of the danger. As many as 3 pupils at the same primary school in Seascale developed leukemia. Despite Yorkshire Television's intense coverage of the issue, the discharges continued.
In the world. The radioactivity here can be measured quite simply with a Geiger counter. It's in the mud and it's on the beach. Scientist Dr. Philip Day is measuring this radioactive pollution.
We tried to find out if there was any truth in these reports. It is strictly forbidden to film around the reprocessing plant at Sellafield, nor is it possible to take photographs on site, nor can we get near to the discharge pipe. It proves difficult to arrange an interview. As a last resort, we finally meet in the car park in front of the plant. What is the link between the radioactive waste and the leukemia cases?
Obviously, the leukemia issue is a difficult one. It's been investigated for years by the UK medical authorities, who are the right people to investigate that sort of issue. And their conclusions are that the leukemia excesses around Sellafield, in one particular locality, cannot be due to our operations.
On the basis of that reasoning, the beach remains open in spite of the plutonium finds. It has been long since assumed within the scientific community that chronic poisoning, even low radiation doses, can trigger cancer. We drove 10 kilometers inland because it is also possible to find the toxic deposits here. The level of radiation has increased on this riverbank. Janine Alice Smith and Sean Burney show us.
It's going up slightly. It's going up to about 30. So that is 3 times nearly what we found sort of lower on the road when we started.
And this is a spot which is freely accessible to the public. A bridle path leads along the riverbank. Burney and Alice Smith are critical of the authorities. They believe that they are being deliberately imprecise about their work.
So when the authorities take a sample and they measure, they might take one sample here.
What I used to say to journalists, they just want to know what happens from year to year. They don't want to know what happened 50 years ago. And, you know, they try and hide that, but it's there.
So you don't take deep samples, they don't take deep samples. They take surface, very few samples are taken. So they get the evidence that they're looking for rather than what would be in the interests of public health.
The authorities haven't even measured plutonium at this spot. We take a soil sample and we'll have it evaluated back in Germany at the University of Mainz. The result turns out to be alarming. The amount of plutonium is up to 10 times higher than the permissible limit.
Okay, that's the first sample. The other sample will come from far more.
How dangerous is it to live in Sellafield? Professor Richard Wakeford from the University of Manchester doesn't think it's that dangerous. The operators like to quote him. After having worked for almost 30 years in the nuclear industry, he is considered to be one of the luminaries on the subject of radiation risks.
Yeah, well, I think that's... We go into the corner over there. Prepare the chair over there. Sure, okay.
I assess the risks from radiation in an aircraft flight or living in sea-scale to be very small, and it should really not be of major concern to parents or anyone else. There are much more important things to be worried about. There are two major ideas. Either childhood leukemia is a rare response to a common but as yet unidentified infection, or large-scale urban rural population mixing, there has been an increase of childhood leukemia. I mean, that's very compelling epidemiological evidence.
Conclusion. Either a virus or population mixing around Sellafield is responsible for cancer, but not the highly toxic nuclear waste from the sea?
I mean, there was...
We are confused and ask a German expert, the physician Klaus Hoffmann, a member of the various German federal government's radiation protection committees. We meet the busy scientist in a Bonn hotel.
What do you say when UK experts stand there and proclaim that these connections don't exist?
Well, they are simply wrong. There is little evidence for the population mixing hypothesis, and there is absolutely no evidence of the virus hypothesis. There is neither a virus, nor are there antibodies. In other words, forget this whole infection hypothesis. These hypotheses that have arisen primarily to explain away any risk from radiation.
Das Strahlenrisiko eben wegzudiskutieren.
It is no longer possible to explain away radiological risks contained in internal IAEA documents. Here we read of the advantages, low energy costs, jobs. But there is also a record here of the very things Professor Wakeford is refuting. Radiation is indeed responsible for shorter life expectancy and premature death. Cancer is also named as the cause. Leukemia, bone cancer, thyroid cancer, lung cancer. Here are private videos from a children's cancer ward in Wales. Professor Chris Busby sent them to us. In recent decades, doctors have been registering a steady increase in childhood leukemia here. For the little ones, the treatment is torture. Everyone is convinced that the leukemia comes from Sellafield. Chris Busby asked us to visit him again. Together with his colleague Richard Bramhall, Busby tells us an incredible story. The cancer statistics around Sellafield are 10 times higher than in the rest of the country.
About 20 now, if they're alive. Or else you have to find somebody.
They will do anything to cover up the truth. We were leaked that data, the database from the Wales Cancer Registry. Someone had a bad conscience.
Eventually the Wales Cancer Registry people said, oh well, we'll give you the data, but not down to the small areas, but down to like the county district areas, which is much bigger. But when the data came, and I put it on the computer, I found that it was the small area data. It wasn't the big. So whoever had done it, either by mistake or because they wanted to leak it, had given us the small area data. After the cancer registry had given us the data, they were sacked. That was it. I put a letter into the British...
people were sacked?
Yeah, all of them, yeah.
Well, they closed the unit down. We don't know what happened.
So this woman, Mary Cotter, who said, "We will give you what you want," she was sacked.
Recently, the House of Lords refused to publish current pediatric cancer numbers, data protection policy. And the nuclear industry, it strikes a balance between cancer rates and costs. The effort required to protect people from radiation exposure should also take stock of the cost implications. We want to find out from the UK health authorities, can it really be true?
To reduce the doses any further might cost disproportionate amount of money that could be actually spent elsewhere. So that's the sort of balancing you have to do.
Is that supposed to mean that you are prepared to accept a number of cancer deaths? To keep the costs of discharging atomic waste into the sea as low as possible?
You are doing that comparison.
I'm reading that.
And that's no different to what happens in many other areas of decision-making in society.
Where do such cost-benefit considerations come from? In our research, we come across the influential ICRP, the International Commission on Radiation Protection. The group operates as an independent charity for the benefit of the public. A request for an interview with the director is refused. But we find a lecture on the internet by the former chairman, Roger Clark.
Society's changed. If you went...
He elucidates the cost-benefit principle. Clark cites Epicurus's utility ethic.
Some examples. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few, right? Everybody
The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few.
Was a good thing. So you vaccinated everybody with immunization.
Insiders tell us that the ICRP is the elongated arm of the nuclear industry. We also come across Professor Wakeford's name on the website, the expert from the University of Manchester. To our surprise, we also find Dr. John Cooper's name from Health Protection Agency.
You are working for the Health Protection Agency.
Yes.
At the same time, you are in the main body of the ICRP.
Yes.
So you give yourself the independent scientific risk from one hand to the other. So in Germany it would be a conflict of interest.
A conflict of interest. Yes, that is a problem.
The HPA is the ICRP. The ICRP is made up of government institutions, government representatives. So therefore the HPA, the ICRP, is made up of government representatives. It's not the ICRP is not some great independent body. It's made up, people from the HPA attend meetings of the ICRP and set the standards.
Even former UK Environment Minister Meacher has to admit his impotence.
I, as a minister, my civil servants were not very pleased about this, bringing in people like Chris Busby or other people who are independent scientists like John Large. I mean, they didn't want that kind of confrontation or discussion or debate. I mean, if we had that kind of open, honest exercise, one would feel a lot more confident. But government doesn't want to do this. They just want to go with the official standard view, which actually is the nuclear industry view.
And at the coalface, for years now, Sean Burney and Janine Alice Smith have endured much frustration. No one talks openly. The environmental activist and the mother of a son with leukemia are fighting a quixotic fight.
I think in a way it's quite a sad place. It used to be a really thriving holiday place. People used to come from all over with trains from all parts of Cumbria.
Anger that decisions by governments over many decades have created this nuclear disaster on this coastline. And for most people here, they don't know about it, or if they do know about it, they don't want to know about it. It's out with their control. It's a decision made by government in London.
Sellafield and La Hague show that the disposal of waste into the sea was, and still is, a mistake. However, hardly anyone is prepared to admit it officially, because then you would have to deal with tough questions. Who was lying? What can still be salvaged? And who is going to pay for it? From the northeast Atlantic dump sites all the way up to the coast of Norway, nuclear contamination from barrels and pipes is a problem which is deliberately being brushed under the carpet. This can only be resolved by sealing off the pipes and salvaging the undamaged barrels wherever possible.
Of deadly wastes, and it's all moving towards our lifeblood, the Columbia River.
This is probably the most dangerous stuff on the planet ever. Very, very small quantities of this waste. And it's been said that a Dixie cup full of this waste in a crowded restaurant, everyone would be dead in the restaurant inside of an hour. Even the amount that would fit on the leg of a fruit fly is considered a problem dose, and that's happened at Hanford. Fruit flies have landed on contaminated materials and then flown off to go to the lunchroom and deposit contamination on food and on tables and whatnot, and they've had to evacuate a 20-acre area at the Hanford site because of hot fruit flies and wasps. So this waste in these tanks is very dangerous in small quantities, and it has another feature, which is it's dangerous for very, very long periods of time. Bush administration obviously has a war or two to pay for. They're cheaping out on protecting public health and safety at the Hanford site. At this point, intend to empty one tank per year. But do the math, 170 tanks left to go to empty out. Over 100 years to empty out the tanks at Hanford. I mean, no way will those tanks last that long. I mean, one small earthquake out there could spell disaster for this region.
I think you said the Hanford was getting for cleanup $2 billion a year.
Yes.
And I think that's what we spend per day on the war in Iraq.
Yeah, that's about right. We like to say that they spend that by breakfast in Iraq.
Though it's unlikely anyone will ever set off a nuclear device on top of the school, that's what they prepared for today. Together with the Seattle Police Department, the State Patrol, and the Health Department, the National Guard got ready to deal with a weapon of mass destruction.
It's a simulated exercise that we had an explosion on the top of the community college with a radiation component to it. So our team is called in to assist in identifying the radiation source, the isotopes.
One of the most serious abuses of human rights has come through the Pentagon's development of, production of, and use of depleted uranium munitions. These munitions have created an unending toll of casualties wherever they've been used. That the mere use of such munitions constitutes an offense against humanity. We're talking about something that will never go away.
This is an aluminum model of one tank round that's fired by an Abrams tank. This is aluminum. If this was actual, this thing would be over 10 pounds of solid uranium. We know contaminated with plutonium, neptunium, and americium. You fire one of these rounds, 40% breaks up into dust and oxides that be inhaled, ingested, absorbed, contaminate air, water, and soil. The United States Army Environmental Policy Institute, which is co-located here, confirmed that in their 1995 report. They stated, quote, "There is no way to reduce the toxicity of uranium munitions." And they ignore it and continue today.
First of all, I'd like to mention that DU, depleted uranium, had a prior name, and it was DOLRAM. All the military manuals refer to it as DOLRAM, D-U-L-L-R-A-M, which is depleted uranium, low-level radioactive material. Well, they so eloquently remove the LLRAM and just call it depleted uranium now, and remove the low-level radiation part of it, minutely enough. I don't know how they got to go hide that part. I don't know where the science was that allowed them to take those last four parts of the acronym off. Because we know that the blood donor system has been contaminated. We know that the organ donor system is contaminated. If you have a returning soldier coming from this battlefield, and what they like to do in the military is they like to do command-directed blood donors. The whole commander will say, everybody go down to Red Cross today, go to the gym, give them some blood, and you can have the rest of the day off. All right, we get the day off. Soldier loves a day off. So he goes down and gives up the blood, but the blood is contaminated, and then the blood goes into the blood donor system. And then you want to get a kidney from a healthy little 21-year-old who just returned from the combat field, but the kidney is the most exposed organ to these heavy metals, because the fluids are pushing them through to excrete and like that, and they just rip through these organs. This is going to be around long after even the human experience. They had no idea that these particles were so small that they were going through their filters. They were breathing them and they were ingesting them, and these soldiers have, alpha emitting particles lodged in their lungs and all over their body, and the qualitative result or the end result is that they've had children that were born with deformities, incredible deformities.
Some people have described it that we will be at war with Iraq till the end of Earth, because we cannot turn off the weapons that we used against Iraq. This is the time test. You have to be able to stop the weapons at the end of the war. Depleted uranium has a half-life of 4.5 million years, so we are at war with Iraq for the end of time.
Well, Hanford has 200 square miles of contaminated groundwater below the site there, and that is spreading over time because the contaminants in the soil are leaking at a constant rate into the into the groundwater.
I know this sounds incredible to people, but there are 40 miles of unlined trenches at Hanford, if you stretch them end to end, into which our federal government, your government, was dumping radioactive waste from nuclear weapons production and its own reactors until the year 2004, when we put those pictures on air and in our campaign literature for Initiative 297. It's been against the law for decades for a municipal government to dump in municipal garbage in unlined landfills, but our federal government thinks it's okay for radioactive waste, even though it seeps right out of those trenches, and that stuff is all moving through the soil to the Columbia River. What they're not telling the public is that they also deliberately dumped out of the high-level nuclear waste tanks in the 1950s and 1960s billions of gallons of liquids into the soil, and it is very, very toxic. It is radioactive. It includes uranium that with half-lives of hundreds of thousands of years, and plutonium and technetium-90 and strontium-90 and technetium-99, excuse me, and all sorts of chemicals as well.
Since the end of the war, just one study has shed some light on this. It was carried out in Fallujah in 2009 and was published in a major medical review. This document contains worrying results about the rise in the number of deformed babies. They reveal an explosion in such cases since 2005, 1 year after the Battle of 2004. Aberystwyth, on the west coast of Wales. The author of this paper is Professor Chris Busby, a British scientist specializing in radioactivity. He's Secretary of the European Committee on Radiation Risks. Chris Busby is a regular mainstream media guest. In his black beret, he has become an easily recognizable figure on the BBC or Al Jazeera. He was recently consulted on the consequences of the nuclear crisis at Fukushima. Unlike the Iraqi authorities, he has investigated in Fallujah.
But the way around that is to just knock on the door and say, excuse me, I'm asking how many people have got cancer here in the last 5 years and who lives here? It's very simple. Because if you know who lives there and how old they are, you can then predict how many cancers they should have on the basis of the national average and rates and so on, and just compare them with the numbers that they report. And the one divided by the other is the relative risk. So we did that.
Did you try to go by yourself to Fallujah?
No way. I've got too many people after my guts. I'm not going to go and stick myself out there. Somebody will pop a bullet through me.
So, how did you...
Yeah, no, well, all I did was I told them what to do. I said, look, I'll tell you what to do. I'll create the questionnaire based on the ones I've done.
And even for an Iraqi team recruited by Chris Busby, the task was complicated.
There's some places they went to, they got beaten up because they thought they were from the Secret Service or the State or the CIA or something. So then we had to start sending people around with some local person that everybody knew, councillor or something. And after that it was okay. And we just finished it when the Iraqi government found out about it, and then they put out something on the television saying we were terrorists and anybody who answered the questions would go to jail. But it was too late. We'd done it by then, you see.
On top of the questionnaire, Chris Busby asked for samples of soil and water. Samples of residents' hair were also taken. The test results are astonishing.
In these hair samples and the soil samples and all, we measured 52 different elements. So we looked at strontium and barium and neodymium and cobalt and copper and cesium and calcium, and you name it, we looked at it. And what we found was that the only element there that could explain that level of congenital malformations and cancer was uranium.
He believes it's not the white phosphorus that is harming the inhabitants of Fallujah, but uranium.
So, for instance, in Fallujah, the rates of leukemia, for example, are 38 times the expected number based on Egypt. Breast cancer is more than 10 times. Childhood cancer is 14 times. I forget the exact details, but they're huge numbers. It's like nothing that you have ever found in any epidemiological study anywhere ever. This is like the highest rate of genetic damage in any population ever studied. It's worse than Hiroshima.
Why is Fallujah compared to Hiroshima? How did uranium come to be in this city? Officially, no nuclear weapons were used in Fallujah. I continue my inquest in Champaign, Illinois, 200 kilometers from Chicago, and home to Doug Rock. For Doug Rock, the presence of uranium in Fallujah comes as no surprise. This former high-ranking officer served more than 35 years in the U.S. Army, in particular during the First Gulf War. At that time, he headed a research program into the consequences of a new uranium-based weapon. After testing on behalf of the Pentagon, he became its first victim. He now suffers from several cancers and renal problems.
It's part of the Nevada test we did. And what I'm doing is blowing up, shooting and burning up. Well, what you see is the direct impact on the uranium munitions, the uranium impact, but the uranium that breaks up burns and burns and burns and burns and burns for a long time. You can see how long it lasts.
He claims that uranium has been used in American munitions since 1991, in missiles, shells, and armor plating for military vehicles.
And when I shot up wood 4x4s, man, they were great. This stuff is good. Okay? I mean, you have to understand, the purpose is to kill and destroy. And uranium weapons are the ultimate, because it's a massive fireball of burning uranium fragments that are moving extraordinarily high velocity. And fragments that are not burning that cause massive secondary explosions or massive fires in anything that will burn.
Uranium is a mineral used in nuclear power plants. Part of it is enriched and used as fuel for the reactors. The rest is radioactive waste, known as depleted uranium. As the costs of storage are high, the U.S. Army decided to use some of it to manufacture munitions and armor plating. Doug Rock sees depleted uranium quite simply as a nuclear weapon.
And yes, it is. It's solid radioactive waste. It's chemically toxic. It's radioactive for eternity. It's a dirty bomb. And yeah, it is, let's call it nuclear for what it is. It's nuclear waste used to kill and destroy, thus contaminate air, water, soil, and food that remains there to cause harm for eternity.
This weapon was used for the first time in Iraq in 1991. At the time, the U.S. Army asked Doug to inspect the tons of burnt-out Iraqi tanks destroyed by depleted uranium missiles.
This is measuring the contamination on destroyed...
As a result, Doug and his team were seriously contaminated by inhaling uranium dust. Today, Doug is one of the only survivors of that group.
I mean, you can look at me. I mean, what I looked like then, I was a lot different. Extraordinarily healthy, and now everybody's extraordinarily sick. This is me right there. Yeah, we were the best of the best. Won't lie for them anymore. It's not worth it. Too many people are sick. Too many people are dead.
Since this photo was taken, 21 members of his team have died. Returning from Iraq, Doug submitted an unfavorable report on the use of depleted uranium.
Well, once I told the U.S. Army that it was dangerous, we couldn't clean it up, and they couldn't do it, they sent me packing. Adios amigos. We don't want to hear from you. We don't want to talk to you. I mean, you got your job. Keep doing things, but shut up and go away.
The U.S. Army never took Doug Rock's recommendations into account.
They use it in Fallujah, so you think there is... Fallujah, extensively in Fallujah, totally extensively in Fallujah, not a question. And we see everything in all the other people, and we see every place that's been used, we see it. I mean, you could try to clean it up, but you can't. That's what I tried to do, and I couldn't.
In Japan, officials estimate that 7 tons of radioactive waste is flowing into the ocean every hour at the crippled Daiichi nuclear facility. The source of the leaking waste appears to be Reactor 2. Attempts to clog the leak with cement have failed, and new attempts to plug the hole with a junk shot of sawdust, chemicals, and shredded newspaper don't appear to be working either. It will then take hundreds of thousands of years for this mess caused by the use of nuclear power to decay to safety. For more on these new developments out of Japan, I'm joined by Paul Gunter, Director of Reactor Oversight of the Reactor Oversight Project at Beyond Nuclear. Paul, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, Tom.
What's the latest status update?
Well, we have a situation where it's now confirmed that there are uncontrolled releases of radioactivity going into the ocean. There principally are this tremendous amount of water that Tokyo Electric Power Company, over 11,000 tons of radioactive water that's been used to wash over the melting fuel in the fuel pools and the reactors, and now they simply don't have any place to put that. So they have now started a process to dump this radioactive waste into the ocean. And then we have another leak from the trench, the concrete trench, where we were last monitoring. We heard the readings are over 100 rem per hour, which is an intensely radioactive field at the surface of this water.
If I could just interrupt you, 100 rem, one rem is 1,000 millirems or 1,000,000 microrems. And
these are deadly.
I mean, isn't annual exposure just normal background, like around 1 millirem?
These are deadly fields of radiation that are
100 rems is
100.
I thought, isn't 5 rems like lifetime exposure for nuclear
worker dose? Yes, yeah. But we have situations now around this concrete trench that is spewing intensely radioactive water into the ocean as well. So we've got tremendous amounts of radioactive inventory, and I'm afraid that each day that this proceeds, it looks more and more like just an unprecedented event where we thought Chernobyl was different from 3 Mile Island. Fukushima is starting to look very much different than what Chernobyl presented as a threat.
How so?
Well, right now we have clearly the nuclear industry dumping all this radioactive waste. We have the nuclear industry apologists, mainstream media. What they're not telling us is how all this radioactivity being dumped is going to bioaccumulate and then biomagnify back up through the food chain. So phytoplankton.
Well, we're at the top of the food chain, aren't we?
Phytoplankton, plankton, small fish, large fish. This is going to have some very serious consequence for the fishing industry.
Well, hundreds of thousands and possibly millions of people will ultimately die as a result of this. If a million people died because of Chernobyl, and that number is being taken very seriously by scientists, A, that's just going to happen, and B, that the really only genuine way we can eliminate the dangers of radiation are to eliminate nuclear power plants and nuclear weapons.
Absolutely.
Stop mining uranium.
Absolutely. The only relevant protection is prevention, and if you want to prevent another Fukushima only with a different name, maybe it's Seabrook, maybe it's Dresden, maybe it's Callaway, but these plants are aging, these designs are flawed, human error can enter into this picture at any moment. It could be a digital tsunami next time from cyber attack.
Sure.
These are all the concerns that surround the inherent danger in nuclear power.
Anything that brings down the grid could produce essentially the same effect of
That's the opening salvo.
Yep. Paul,
thanks again.
Thanks so much for being with us tonight. I appreciate it. Don't think just because we live far away from Japan that their nuclear crisis won't affect us. Rainwater and milk in Berkeley, California have been found to contain radioactive iodine at more than 18,000% above drinking water standards. The organization Food and Water Watch wrote a letter to President Obama asking for clarifications on the dangers of radiation here in the United States. The letter read, "The three agencies that monitor almost all of the food Americans eat have insisted that the U.S. food supply is safe. The agencies, however, have done very little to detail specific ways in which they are responding to the threat of radiation in food." The EPA was supposed to release findings on radiation in rainwater in the U.S. last week, but has since delayed the release until this week. Anyone else have a feeling we're not being told the entire truth? Like the fact that there's no such thing as a safe level of radiation?
Back at the Surrey nuclear plant in Virginia, folks have been waiting so long for a place to send their nuclear waste, they've come up with a new generation of dry casks.
The great thing about the horizontal storage modules is that inside this bunker is the canister that we could actually use for shipment.
Now, all they need is the shipping address.
With nuclear energy and its challenges, besides needing to figure out what to do with all the radioactive waste from power plants, there are plenty of other critical questions, especially since the Fukushima disaster in Japan.
We will take a look at the things that happened in Fukushima Daiichi and see if there aren't some lessons we can learn.